Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I've been asked to talk to you about Australian border protection now and in the future. Australia's national security strategy describes national security in terms of how we prevent threats to our sovereignty, people, assets, infrastructure and institutions, as well as how we recover from the manifestation of those threats. I intend to discuss the notion of border protection as an element of national security, with a particular focus on civil security aspects and Australia's maritime domain. Border protection is considered to be intrinsic to national security. The concept can be considered in terms of facilitating the legitimate movement of product and people across our borders, while countering illegal movements. In a maritime context, border protection goes further and includes managing the legal exploitation of resources and managing the environment, while preventing illegal activity in relation to all of these aspects and responses to instances of maritime terrorism and violence at sea. Secure borders are essential to manage migration, travel and trade in an orderly manner, which in turn promotes more open global economic linkages, social cohesion and trust. The notion of state borders and indeed sovereignty has evolved over time and will no doubt continue to do so, as Professor Kay so clearly pointed out to us earlier today. This is particularly the case in relation to a state's jurisdiction over its maritime boundaries. With recognition in international law of elements of state jurisdiction, or at least governance, over conduct of maritime activity beyond the territorial seas, while maintaining the principles of freedom of navigation and flag state responsibility for vessels. Australia assumes limited governance under international law and maritime regulation of waters around Australia and its offshore territories, encompassing some 45 million square kilometres, or 12.4% of the Earth's oceans, extending from Antarctica to our south, to our maritime boundaries with Indonesia, Timor-Leste and PNG to our north, those of Southwest Pacific nations to our east, and to our SAR coordination boundaries with Indian Ocean Rim nations to our west. In that part of this domain which extends beyond the EEZ, Australia assumes responsibility for governance concerning piracy and maritime counter-terrorism, as well as coordination of maritime search and rescue response. Australia exercises jurisdiction under international and national law over seabed and national resources within our economic zone and those continental shelf seabed extensions, and customs and migration jurisdiction within our territorial sea and contiguous zones. Border protection is a whole-of-government enterprise involving 18 Commonwealth agencies or departments and their state counterparts managed through a complex set of coordinating agencies. This is no less the case in a maritime sense, where the Australian tradition is to manage maritime border security through collaborative arrangements between government departments according to the perceived priorities of the day. Maritime Border Command continues this tradition as a multi-agency task force within the Australian Border Force. Maritime Border Command integrates Border Force, Defence and other government agency staff and assigned assets to exercise operational and tactical jurisdiction over the Australian maritime domain. Maritime border protection is conceived in terms of preventing or countering 8 specific threats. These are illegal exploitation of natural resources, illegal activity in protected areas, illegal maritime arrivals, prohibited imports or exports, piracy, robbery and violence at sea, maritime terrorism, compromise to biosecurity and marine pollution. With the amalgamation of the Department of Immigration and the Australian Customs and Border Protection Service in 2015, the role and functions of Maritime Border Command have evolved slightly from that of its predecessors. The outcome is that Maritime Border Command is focused on the operational and tactical oversight of civil maritime border protection, relying on other divisions within the department for direction and action concerning aspects such as policy, strategy, international engagement, strategic messaging and strategic intelligence. Maritime Border Command retains, however, responsibility for operational level interagency agreement, as well as bilateral and multilateral engagements with Southwest Pacific and Asian partners. This includes acting as the Australian lead on RECAP, the Regional Counter-Piracy Forum based in Singapore, and HAGM, the Australian Coast Guard Agency Forum. Maritime Border Command employs assigned resources to pursue lines of operation focused on deterrence, detection, response and prevention effects in collaboration with Australian regional partners. As to the future, as the threats to civil aspects of national security evolve, so does the notion of Australia's borders and Australia's response to managing its borders. The challenges and interdepartmental responses for Australia are the subject of consideration within the department and other agencies at present. While we expect that the current characterisation of threats to the maritime border protection will prevail, what is clear is all will increase in terms of prevalence and sophistication. Significant increases in trade and migration flow to Australia through our region, including the further development of the cruise ship industry and the inevitable increase in offshore mining infrastructure, will increase the complexity of the border protection challenge, as will vulnerabilities in terms of exploitation by criminal and potentially terrorist organisations. There will be an increased pressure on global resources, including marine fish stocks, as a result of population growth, economic development and depletion of local fish stocks in other regions. Increased irregular migration flows arising from conflict, socio-political tension, potential state failure, climate change effects and economic aspirations will offer opportunities for people smugglers. Technology advances will offer the potential for ever more sophisticated activities by criminals to engage in all forms of illegal behaviour across the border where a profit might be realised. As technologies become available and interests develop, the prevalence of hazardous violent intervention and protest actions by well-intentioned activists at sea is expected to increase. This will be the case as well for terrorist organisations who gain the marine capabilities to match their intent to conduct spectacular violent incidents to degrade social cohesion, confidence in government, affect economic harm, or otherwise pursue their courses. These challenges will in turn necessitate effective, efficient countermeasures across all lines of operation, as well as further development of cooperative engagements between Australian government agencies and regional partners. Australia and the Department of Immigration and Border Protection in particular will seek to oversee border protection in terms of a continuum within which the Border Force will work ahead of, at and after the border to prevent or respond to threats. The ABF continues to position the combat risks before they arrive at the border as a primary means of border protection. The physical border will ultimately become the secondary layer of intervention. We'll use an intelligence-led, risk-based approach to strategic decision-making and operations. This involves underpinning border protection activities by comprehensively anticipating, identifying and responding to risk in order to allow resources to be able to focus on areas where they're needed most. Maritime Border Command is well positioned to synchronise our operational activity with this approach, noting our current lines of operation. Perhaps the most evident manifestation of this approach is that of Operation Sovereign Borders now. to counter the maritime people smuggling threat. This operation involves activity in source and transit countries to deter and disrupt people smuggling activity through strategic messaging and law enforcement cooperation, as well as development of bilateral agreements to support the return of those who do not engage Australia's protection obligations. This activity is supported by an effective maritime detection and response posture and reinforced by regional processing and temporary protection arrangements. Some of the capability solutions we will need are already identified, such as in the context of the defence contribution in terms of surveillance and patrol capabilities. What is clear is that we won't be able to afford to merely replicate current practice or maintain current capabilities. To this end, the Department and partnering agencies are also engaged in a review of maritime surveillance and patrol capabilities. Without prescribing the solutions, I expect this to consider at least niche surveillance solutions for the Christmas and Cocos Island approaches, a persistent surveillance capability across the Torres Strait, supplementary area surveillance capability to augment the defence contributions, monitoring systems in some of our marine parks, enhanced fast patrol capabilities in the Torres Strait, and enhanced data fusion capabilities. In 2018, the Australian Border Force operational divisions will move to a single command premises that will support the co-location of the command nodes, including Maritime Border Command, to facilitate enhanced cooperation and a more agile response. It's a little too early to talk about the requirements for a replacement Cape-class patrol vessel at this point. While the capability is yet to be defined, the need is obvious, as is the opportunity to collaborate with Defence to enhance interoperability and to integrate this future acquisition into the naval shipbuilding plan. One recent example of the type of initiative that will be necessary is the implementation of the Australian Maritime Powers Act. This legislation provides authorities for maritime officers to act across the full spectrum of maritime security operations, from the safety provisions of the Navigation Act to customs, migration and fisheries laws, as well as the legislation for protection of offshore resources, infrastructure and the maritime environment. A second is a planned trusted trader scheme, which will enable the Border Force to focus on suspect activity while facilitating increased trade flows. In conclusion, Australia must continue to capitalise on the potential economic and social opportunities that will present over the next decades. By 2050, almost half of the world's economic output is expected to come from the Indo-Pacific region. This presents opportunities to increase Australia's economy and security, but this can only be achieved through integrated border security capability that manages risk and facilitates the flow of legitimate maritime traffic, manages our marine resource for legitimate use, protects our marine environment and delivers social and economic opportunities for Australians. The Australian approach to border security in this environment is to promote a system of voluntary compliance supported by the capability and intent to identify and respond effectively to acts of non-compliance through a framework of controls and sanctions. Thank you very much for listening to the presentation. I'm happy to take your questions.
Questions for Laver? Peter, Rob Wall.
Yeah.
I might have misinterpreted your observation or your remarks. An armchair commentator is, by definition, someone who's fully. It struck me that your point, the capabilities cannot be replicated, cannot afford to be replicated. And you then outlined in effect have addressed the problem of being able to replicate capabilities and, if not, multiply their performance in matters such as surveillance. Have I misinterpreted what you said?
What I meant by not replicating capability is not really merely replacing platform for platform, but considering the requirements and filling in the gaps in our current capability in order to be able to respond to increasingly sophisticated threats. Right now, as an example, across the Caribbean Sea, the US is dealing with semi-submersibles and submersibles as a vector for delivery of drugs into mainland United States. Will that happen to us? I don't think so. But our ability to respond to small and black traffic across the approaches to Australia will demand that we need a more sophisticated and persistent surveillance solution than we've got right now.
Pete, can you just explain how is it that you as a customer, if you like, engage Navy, the ADF and Border Force in terms of how their current and future capabilities can complement one another?
Yeah, so the role of, as I mentioned perhaps in overview, the role of Maritime Border Command has evolved. So we're less, we're more involved as the tactical commander of the current capability. Our involvement in terms of identifying future capability requirements is more or less the same as a service chief would, in terms of identifying existing and potential future gaps. So I'm actively involved in the Department of Immigration and Border Protection's discussions directly and indirectly with other government agencies about what the future looks like. I'm also actively involved in identifying the requirements, the operational requirements for future capability requirements. I don't get into the acquisition game, and I don't have an independent voice in the debate.
Peter, you made, you've set out what are the questions to be asked about the emerging surveillance and response capability, but could you just comment, when does the current agreement for the provision of the aerial surveillance capability through the Coastwatch program actually end?
Yeah, so that comes up, the next iteration in that comes up in 2020. So it's a here and now problem.
So what state of play are you at for addressing it?
Well, we've established the team. Because this is a contracted capability, we can move in it rather than an owned capability. We expect to be able to move in a reasonably agile fashion to fill in the gaps between the defence capabilities that are coming online. So we're engaged in the requirement definition right now, considering extensive unmanned capabilities as well as manned capabilities. One of the key things will be, for me, a solution for the Torres Strait. Our ability to understand the pattern of life in that very complex stretch of water is a big gap for us in being able to manage that part of the terrain.
So Darren Rushworth from the Amphib Group in Sydney. Ocean Protector enjoys the white ensign and therefore the warship rules, whereas Ocean Shield is a blue flag, Australian national flag. Do you see great advantages of that ship, even though it's got an ABF mission crew on board, but being operated by a merchantman and merchant master? Does the white flag give it great advantage, or is it the genesis of a new model for affordable border patrol in the future?
if it were operated by military as well as operating under a white flag, it would give us the same complementarity as we have between border force capabilities and military capabilities in our patrol vessels. There are certainly advantages. I can operate that vessel in terms of visits overseas a little bit easier, in terms of operational engagement overseas with foreign countries a little bit easier than I can. But then again, there are advantages with the civilian flag state of our border force vessels as well. So they're complementary. There's not a distinct advantage of one arrangement over the other.
Future model, sir?
Sorry?
Future model of a fleet of them?
Look, I don't see a need for a large number of vessels of that proportion in the civil maritime security space. I guess the range of tasks that a vessel of that size would do would be Southern Ocean patrols, patrols in the Southwest Pacific, in the area between Sydney and New Zealand, to counter seasonal fishing transgressions in the high seas regulated fishing area, that sort of task, and of course the tasks on which they're currently assigned. There'll be an ongoing requirement for patrol vessels of about the size of the Cape and Armidale class, to be of course replaced by, in terms of C1180 for the naval vessels. And I think that the tendency for the Cape class will be towards a larger vessel in the future as well.
So I just wanted to see you run upstairs. Thanks. Yeah, Peter, one of the, as we all know, the big issues that is starting to get quite a lot of attention is cybersecurity. And you mentioned in your talk concerns about technological advances. We heard Stuart Kay reminding us about the vulnerability of submarine cables and their importance. I'd be interested to know what sort of liaison involvement from a maritime border protection perspective there may be now or may be required into the future as we try to take hopefully a coordinated approach to enhancing our national cybersecurity efforts. Thank you.
It's certainly an issue. I'm not sure that it's an issue particularly for Maritime Border Command. Potential for cyber intervention to disrupt communications, obviously, more to interfere with arrangements for management of offshore oil and gas installations. It's not an area that I'm actively considering at the moment, but perhaps it should be, along with Professor Kay's observations regarding cables.
So, Sue assures me that the value of the wine will not require you to put it on the gift register. But, thank you very much indeed for your enlightenment.